The early Great Western Railway not only ran the fastest services in the world, but built locomotives that were technically far in advance of all other locos in the UK at that time. The GWR was created by an Act of Parliament in 1835 to provide a double-tracked rail link between Bristol, the first terminus in the world, and London Paddington. Despite most of the country's railways plumping for the 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge, the Great Western Railway's chief engineer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, convinced the GWR's board of directors that a wider gauge would increase speed, whilst offering higher passenger comfort. Soon, track laying began for the Great Western Railway in the broad gauge of 7.25 inches. Isambard Kingdom Brunel specified the first GWR locomotives, but it was the Great Western Railway's first Locomotive Superintendent, Daniel Gooch, who designed the iconic Firefly and Iron Duke Class 222s, more readily associated with the broad gauge days of the railway. Daniel Gooch was succeeded by Joseph Armstrong. Little is generally remembered about Armstrong's short time at the GWR, but perhaps his major contribution was giving numbers to all the locomotives when previously the broad gauge engines had just carried names. Armstrong's former assistant, William Dean, the next Locomotive Superintendent, developed the Dean Single class of loco, which spanned the change from broad to standard gauge in the 1890s. Despite an Act of Parliament in 1846 declaring that all railways should conform to the standardised 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge, the Great Western Railway had taken until 1892 to switch to the now standard gauge. Dean is also credited with designing the 440 Express, but the Great Western Railway's next chief engineer, Dean's former chief assistant George Jackson Churchward, is better remembered. Introduction of the 440 City class brought Churchward worldwide recognition, and he went on to produce some of the GWR's classic classes, such as the Saint, County, Star, and Mighty Mogul. Churchward's 2- and 4-cylinder 460s were considered, even at the time, to be superior to any class of locomotive operated by other British railway companies. However, this came at a cost. The other railway companies could produce 3 460s for the cost of 2 GWR 460s. But as Churchward pointed out, one of his 460 locos could easily pull 2 of theirs backwards. The early 1920s saw the arrival of Charles Collett, the designer of the iconic King and Castle classes. Collett was also tasked with standardizing the many types of loco in service with the Great Western Railway. Through amalgamations with other railways, the GWR had amassed a wide variety of locos. Charles Collett also introduced the biggest change, diesel power, in the form of the elegant, streamlined railcars. The final Great Western Railway Chief Mechanical Engineer, Frederick Hawksworth, had worked for the company for 43 years before taking over in 1941. Despite talent and skills, the wartime climate of austerity and government control of the railway's activities during the Second World War prevented Hawksworth from shining as a bold designer. And instead, Hawksworth concentrated his efforts on improving the GWR's existing rolling stock, particularly the modified hall. Sadly, no examples of one of his most notable new designs, the County Class 460, survived. Taking its name from an extinct class of Churchward 440s, the Counties were the last GWR two-cylinder 460s, ending a tradition that began with the Saints 42 years before. Hawksworth remained Chief Mechanical Engineer through nationalisation and the formation of the Western Region of British Railways in 1948, and continued designing locomotives until retiring at the end of 1949. From the Great Western Railway's 1840s broad gauge Firefly, through to the elegant 1940s Diesel Railcar, locomotives constructed by the Great Western Railway delivered a century of world-class engines unsurpassed in terms of strength and style. Following on from the success of the Star class, Daniel Gooch designed several standardized locomotive types. The first was the Firefly class of broad gauge 222 steam passenger locomotive, introduced into service between March 1840 and December 1842. Based upon North Star, but with larger boilers, a total of 61 Firefly class locomotives were built by Jones, Turner and Evans of Newton-le-Willows. Remarkably for 1840, the original Firefly achieved an unprecedented average speed of 50 miles per hour. Withdrawn from service between 1860 and 1879, no original examples of the Firefly class survived. But Didcot Railway Centre is the home to Firefly, a faithful replica conceived by the members of the Firefly Trust and built over a 20-year period. John Moss came up with the idea to build a new Firefly in 1982, whilst renovating the original station buildings at Bristol Temple Meads. Through contacts, Moss was able to access the original drawings and drew up plans with necessary 21st century modifications for the boiler and the brake systems. The Firefly Trust then set about fundraising. It took 5 years to raise enough money to make a start, initially in Bristol, and then at Didcot, where Firefly now runs on original broad gauge track found at Burlescombe in Devon. Firefly is a lasting testament to the engineering skills of the Firefly Trust members and their tenacity in finding £200,000 to build the replica. When it comes to operating Firefly, the engine is not like other steam locomotives. With a 222 wheel arrangement, Firefly has a single 7 feet diameter driving wheel. There's also no standard brake valve. Pulling a Replica 6-wheeled broad-gauge third-class open carriage based on a design dating from 1838, Firefly terminates in the original Didcot transfer shed, which was used for transferring freight between Brunel's broad-gauge goods wagons and standard-gauge wagons. This 422 Dean single was built in 1894 and is one of the earliest original GWR passenger steam locomotives in existence. Designed by William Dean, the first 30 locos were built as 222s. 8 were then built as convertible broad gauge locos, and the remainder were all standard gauge. Part of the 3031 class, number 3035 originally carried the name Bellerophon, but was renamed Beaufort in December 1895. The class was built for working the West of England expresses between London and Newton Abbot via Bristol. But when passenger loads increased in the early 1900s, 440 locomotives were introduced. Once a larger turntable was installed at Wolverhampton Stafford Road shed, the class began working to Birmingham and Wolverhampton from Paddington. In addition, other routes given over to the 422s included Worcester to Oxford and Bristol to Taunton. The 1920s was a time of amalgamation, when the GWR took over many smaller railways throughout the West Country and into Wales, including the Cardiff Railway. This 040 saddle tank, with works number 3799, was built in 1898 as Cardiff Railway No. 5 by Kitson & Company, a locomotive manufacturer based in Hunslet in Leeds, West Yorkshire. Built for the Cardiff Railway, No. 5 was half of an exclusive class of engines called the Cardiff Railway class. Joining the GWR following the grouping in 1923, No. 5 was renumbered 1338. Placed into storage until the Second World War, the engine was loaned to Stewart & Lloyd's Limited and then transferred to Taunton Depot in 1943 for work in Bridgewater Docks, before another move to Swansea Docks in 1960. Having covered 354,000 miles, 1338 was withdrawn in September 1963. Languishing behind the up platform at Bleedon and Uphill Station in Somerset, the loco was more or less forgotten until 1987, when 1338 was taken to Didcot and fully restored. Based upon William Dean's Atbara class, the 440 City class was designed by George Churchward for express passenger work. Outshopped in 1903, City of Truro, the 8th out of a batch of 10 locomotives, was also the 2000th locomotive built at Swindon Works. Fitted with slide valves and an unsuperheated boiler, City of Truro was timed on the 9th of May 1904, travelling at a speed of 102.3 miles per hour, whilst hauling the 150-ton Ocean Mail Special from Plymouth to London Paddington. The city of Truro had become the first steam locomotive to break the 100 miles per hour speed barrier. Initially, the whole affair was somewhat low-key, with no formal confirmation of the speed record. But from 1922 onwards, the Great Western Railway was using the city of Truro prominently in publicity materials. Rebuilt with a Swindon Standard No. 4 superheated boiler in September 1911, the longer smokebox changed the locomotive's appearance quite dramatically, and further work was undertaken in 1915 when the locomotive was fitted with piston valves. Originally numbered 3440, the entire city class was renumbered in December 1912, with City of Truro becoming number 3717 in City Class 37. Despite being a record breaker, the City of Truro worked in regular service, but as rail travel grew in popularity, so did the demand for heavier and larger locomotives, and so City of Truro was withdrawn in 1931. Pressure was placed upon the GWR's directors to preserve the loco, but they refused. Fortunately, however, the LNER's Railway Museum was willing to house the engine, and City of Truro was sent to York on the 20th of March 1931. But the City of Truro was brought back into service by British Railways Western Region in 1957. Based at Didcot, the locomotive was used for special excursions and regular services on the Newbury and Southampton branch lines. Renumbered 3440, the engine was given the elaborate, fully lined-out Victorian livery, with Indian red frames carried by GWR Express locomotives during the early part of the 20th century. Withdrawn for a second time in 1961, City of Truro stayed at Swindon's GWR Museum until 1984, when she was restored and then moved to the National Railway Museum. Now a semi-permanent regular at the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway, it was only in 2010 that the loco returned to the green unlined livery with black frames and the 3717 number that she'd carried for most of her GWR life. The third locomotive to leave Wooden Brothers scrapyard, this magnificent Churchward mogul, number 5322, miraculously avoided the cutter's torch. In total, 342 of the class were built, but this early 43 is one of only 2 moguls in preservation and the only operational example. In the summer of 1917, the Army called for the British Railways to supply 160 locomotives to help transport supplies from the Channel ports to the front line. Asked for 080 locomotives, the Great Western Railway did not have this type, so they instead agreed to supply 2 60s, which in terms of power and efficiency were practically equal to the 080 engines. "5322 was one of 20 GWR 260s built at Swindon Works in 1917. Sent new to France, 5322 served on trains running between Calais and the railheads for the front line. Demobbed in 1919 at Chester, 5322 was based at Andover Junction at the end of 1947, working the Midland and South Western Junction railway line between Cheltenham and Andover. Following nationalisation, some of the 241 moguls owned by British Railways were withdrawn from service immediately. Others remained, with the last 6 43s condemned in 1964. 5322 was one of these, being taken in April 1964 from the locomotive's final allocated shed at Pontypool Road Depot to Wooden Brothers scrapyard, also in South Wales. In 1969, after considerable persuasion, the Loco was acquired by a Great Western Society member. The first ex-Great Western Railway locomotive to leave the scrapyard for preservation, 5322 was restored to working order by devoted members of the Great Western Society's South Wales Group. 5322 moved to Didcot in 1973 and was used on open days for a few years before becoming a static item. Following full restoration, the Mogul returned to traffic in 2008 in the khaki livery of the Railway Operating Division, with white ROD lettering and numbers applied to the tender. Designed by Charles Collett, the 5600 class tank locomotive was the only 06 two-wheel arrangement locomotive built new by the Great Western Railway. The first engine, number 5600, was introduced into traffic in 1924. There were no unusual parts used in the design of the class, apart from the smokebox overhang which ended at the buffer beam, so no prototype was produced. A total of 200 locomotives were built in 3 batches. Number 5619 was built by the Great Western Railway at Swindon Works in 1925. The 56 class provided powerful mixed traffic locomotives, but most of the class were confined to hauling coal trains in the Welsh valleys. The nature of this work demanded high adhesive weight, plenty of power with good braking ability, but no need for speed. The 3-ton 1500 weight bunkers were perfect as the distances from pit to port were short. One real feature of the class was that the tank engines ran better in reverse than in forward gear, making the trailing wheel into a bogie wheel. (5619) was initially allocated to Chester, but was soon sent for use in the Welsh valleys. However, by the 1930s, the South Wales coal trade was in decline, and the 5600 class was reallocated to other parts of the network. The first withdrawals from British Rail service for the 56 class started in May 1962, and 5619 was sent to Barry for scrap in 1964. One of 9 of the class to have survived into preservation, 5619 was the 40th locomotive to be rescued from Woodhams in 1973. Restored and brought back to steam in 1981, the loco worked hard until the boiler certificate expired in 1991. The locomotive then rested whilst funds were raised to pay for the overhaul. 5619 was moved to the Flour Mill Locomotive Repair Workshop in Gloucestershire for a full overhaul in 2006, returning once more to steam in 2008. Number 5637 is another member of the 200-strong Collett-designed 56 class of 062 tank locomotives. The 56s were designed for use on heavy freight trains on the grueling gradients of the Welsh Valley lines. But these powerful locomotives were also used extensively for passenger work. The 56s were based upon the earlier 062Ts, built by the Taff Vale Railway and used widely by South Wales Railway companies prior to their absorption into the Great Western Railway in the early 20s. Mostly associated with South Wales, the 56 class soon gained the nickname Taffy tanks. Number 5637 was built in 1925 in the Great Western Railway's workshops at Swindon and spent all its life in South Wales, entering traffic at Cardiff Catay's shed in late September 1925. Transferred 6 weeks later to Barry Shed, 5637 was used on local services in the Newport and Cardiff areas. Withdrawn from traffic in June 1964, 5637 arrived at the Barry scrapyard in September that year. In August 1974, number 5637 became the 61st locomotive to leave the Woodham Brothers yard when it was purchased by the Birmingham Railway Museum. In 1981, the loco was sold without any restoration to Thamesdown Borough Council for leasing to the Swindon and Cricklade Railway and was purchased by a group of volunteers at the railway for restoration. In 1998, after almost 18 years of restoration, 5637 was steamed for the first time since 1964. The locomotive was transferred by road to the East Somerset Railway for running in, and has become the ESR's primary locomotive. Designed by Charles Collett, the 6000 460 King class was built between 1927 and 1930. In total, 30 of these powerful express passenger locos were built. Despite several new ideas for improved loco performance at the time the King class was being designed, Charles Collett instead decided, like the slightly earlier Castle class, to stick to George Churchward's 1907 four-cylinder Star for the King class blueprint. Assigned to the National Collection and moved to Swindon Stock Shed for preservation in March 1968 and continued to operate until the threat of a costly overhaul forced the locomotive into retirement in 1987. Swapped with the Swindon Railway Museum for Evening Star, King George V moved to the National Railway Museum in 2008. An unsung hero of the steam era, the Great Western Railway's 060 pannier tanks were the workhorses of the GWR. They were to be found all over the Great Western Railway, on shunting duties, hauling freight, local, suburban and branch line passenger trains. The origins of the 57 class lie with the GWR's 27 class of six-wheeled shunting engines, which were converted from saddle tanks. Proving easier to access for inspection and maintenance, the pannier tank loco became a mainstay for the Great Western Railway. Following a gap, pannier tank production resumed under Charles Collett in 1929, and 7752 is one of the early batch, having been built by the North British Locomotive Company Limited in Glasgow in November 1930 for the Great Western Railway Company. 7752 was delivered to Swindon factory along with 7750. Based at Aberdare until May 1934, 7752 was recalled to Swindon Works for general repair and then allocated to Newport, staying there mostly until August 1943. Number 7752 was moved to Aberbeeg and Aberdare sheds, and then in 1946 onwards to Tondu. The engine stayed there until late 1951, when 7752 was briefly placed into storage. The loco was then sent to Caerphilly Works for a heavy general repair, before returning to Tondu for the majority of its BR life. Sold to the London Transport Executive in 1959, 7752 acquired London Transport livery and was renumbered L94, before spending the next 12 years working engineering trains for London Transport. Number 7752 even found a moment of glory when it hauled Britain's last standard gauge steam train on the Met on the 6th of June 1971. Purchased by Tyseley for preservation, 7752 required surprisingly little work before entering service. Repainted into early 1950s BR black when at the East Lancs Railway in 1994, 7752 has since been outshopped in GWR livery, with the letters GWR on its tanks, and is seen here during a season at the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway. The 1400 class was designed by Charles Collett to replace the Wolverhampton 517 class for branch line passenger work. Rather than designing a new locomotive, Charles Collett decided to retain Armstrong's 1868 style for the 042 tank engine, with a few modern refinements. The first batch, numbered 4800 to 4874, were built with auto gear for working with trailer cars and fitted with ATC. Called auto trains, the 48 series was linked mechanically to an auto coach, which is a specialist coach designed specifically for this purpose. When plans were put forward for converting some GWR engines to oil burning, it was decided that the modified 2800 class would be renumbered in the 4800 series, and so the original 4800 class was renumbered 1400 to 1474. Frequently used in auto train operations with a push-pull engine and coach service, 1450 was built in 1932 as part of the 4800 class and was renumbered in 1946. Auto Train 1450 spent most of its working life in Oxford. The class began to be withdrawn in 1956, and 1450 was one of the last locos to be withdrawn from service in early 1965. Often seen visiting preserved lines with auto trailer number 178, which was built in 1930, both are usually resident on the Dean Forest Railway. By 1949, a total of 863 57 class locos had been built, making them the second most produced British class of steam locomotive. Very few alterations were made to the design of the class throughout its production life. Perhaps the most noticeable change was the shape of the cab. Introduced during the production of number 8750 in 1933, The cab backplate was blended into the cab sides, and a new style of oblong front and rear cab windows replaced the plain round design. These changes resulted in the subclass 875, of which 3738 is a member. Emerging from Swindon Works in September 1937, the Loco was allocated to Old Oak Common Depot and ended its 500,000-mile working life in August 1965 at Cardiff East Docks. Sent to Wood & Brothers scrapyard, 3738 became the 49th locomotive to be rescued when the engine was bored by two Great Western Society members. 3738 arrived at Didcot Railway Centre in 1974 and by 1976 had been fully restored. Developed by Charles Collett, the GWR's 32 series Dukedog or Earl class was a hybrid 440 constructed from the parts of two older locomotive classes. Between 1936 and 1939, locomotives were constructed with Duke class boilers on Bulldog class double frames. One of the last classes to retain outside frames, 29 Dukedogs were built, plus the prototype conversion, made up from a Duke fitted with the frames of a Bulldog class locomotive. The only difference between this prototype and the production Earl locomotives was the use of 3 feet 2-inch bogie wheels instead of the 3 feet 8-inch wheels. Number 3217 comprised of the frames from Bulldog number 3425, which was built in 1906, and as a later Bulldog had the straight square frame over the driving wheel. The boiler came from Duke class number 3282, which was originally named Chepstow Castle and had been built in 1899. The first production batch of numbers 3200 to 3219 was fitted with boilers that were either non-superheated or used one-row superheaters. Emerging from the rebuild at Swindon Works in March 1938, number 3217 was allocated the name the Earl of Berkley, but this name was not carried at the time. The whole class was renumbered in 1946 upon the arrival of a new class of engines, and 3217 became number 9017. Finally, the locomotive received its original name, the Earl of Berkley, in preservation. With a 2P power classification, the Dukedogs were suited to light passenger work and were in regular use on the Cambrian line during the 1950s. Weighing in at 89 tons, including the 40-ton tender, they were one of the few classes light enough to be permitted on the wooden Barmouth Bridge. Following nationalisation, the Earl class started to be withdrawn from service in July 1948. But number 9017 worked another 12 years until October 1960. The Earl of Berkley is the only Dukedog now in existence, with the remainder of the class scrapped. The locomotive arrived at the Bluebell Railway on the 15th of February 1962. 9017 was overhauled in 2002. Work included major boiler repairs, the fitting of a new smokebox tube plate, which was manufactured in the Bluebell's own workshops, and completely new sections of front and back main frames. The Dukedog returned to traffic on the 1st of November 2003. Designed by Charles Collett, 7802 Bradley Manor is a member of the 7800 Manor class. Built by the Great Western Railway at Swindon Works in January 1938, the engine was allocated initially to Old Oak Common, before being transferred to Bristol in 1939. Like most of its class, the 7802 eventually ended up on the Cambrian section, arriving at Machynlleth in 1946 and staying until a final transfer to Shrewsbury in 1964. Withdrawn from service in November 1965, Bradley Manor was sent to Woodham Brothers Scrapyard in July 1966 and is one of 9 7800s to survive into preservation. Initially purchased as a donor engine for Earl Stoke Manor in 1979, the owners had a change of heart and decided to return Bradley Manor to operational condition in 1983. Just 10 years later, the loco returned to steam. Usually based at the Severn Valley Railway, 7802 sadly failed her boiler inspection in February 2011, and her long-term fate hangs in the balance. .3803 is a member of Charles Collett's 2884 class of heavy freight long-distance locomotives. The 2884 class was a development of George Churchward's similar 1903-28 class, which was the first British engine capable of pulling 2,000 tons. Little had changed between Churchward's original design and Collett's 2884 class, except that the 2800s had been experiencing problems with the sealing on internal steam pipes, and so they were being replaced with external pipework, and Charles Collett incorporated outside steam pipes into his upgrade from the outset. Although 35 years had elapsed between the Churchward and Collett 280s, little other work was truly needed. The 2884 class could really only be distinguished by their side window cabs, shorter safety valve bonnets and whistle shields. After a service life covering almost 727,000 miles, she was withdrawn in July 1963 and sent to Woodham Scrapyard in Barry. Rescued in November 1983, number 3803 arrived in Buckfast Lee, where after a lengthy overhaul and restoration costs in excess of £350,000, she returned to steam in 2005. .3650 was outshopped from Swindon Works in December 1939. As part of lot number 325, the 50-ton loco cost £2,844 new and incorporated Collett's improved cab design. The first shed allocation for 3650 was in January 1940 at Tyseley Depot in the Midlands. Over the course of the next 21 years, the locomotive was allocated to a further 6 depots around Bristol and South Wales before being condemned on the 24th of September 1963. The same year, British Railways sold 3650 on to Stevenson Clark, and following removal of the vacuum brakes and steam heat, the locomotive was sent to PD Fuels Limited's colliery in South Wales. Only minor maintenance was carried out during 3650's time at the private colliery, so eventually firebox bulges caused by the lack of washing out, a thin front tube plate and worn tyres stopped the locomotive working. On the 31st of October 1969, a Great Western Society member purchased 3650 and moved the loco to Hereford, where some restoration was undertaken. But heavier repairs were required, so ownership was transferred and 3650 moved to Didcot Railway Centre the following year. Although virtually a complete engine, due to very poor condition, 3650 was intended to be the donor engine in the restoration of 3738. The remains of 3650 were placed into storage in 1972, but in 1984, GWS member Brian Thompson started to dismantle the parts. By the autumn of 1987, 3650 was stripped down to its frames. Restoration could finally start using Swindon methods as far as possible. With the exception of raw materials and castings, all the work and manufacture of replacement parts was undertaken by the restoration team. Finally, after more than 20 years of dedicated restoration work, the locomotive was completed. For the running-in period, 3650 was turned out in its industrial Stevenson Clark blue livery with red lettering. The loco was then repainted in its original 1939 Great Western Railway green shirt button roundel livery and entered traffic in April 2009. It was under Charles Collett's control that diesel power first appeared on the GWR. In 1933, the first of a very successful series of railcars were introduced. Some were configured for long-distance express services with buffet counters, others for branch line and parcels work, and some were designed as two-car sets. Very much a design of the times, the railcar featured rounded, air-smoothed, streamlined bodywork, soon acquiring the nickname Flying Banana. But by the time number 22 was produced in 1940, the body shape had become slightly more angular, yet the nickname remained. In total, 38 diesel railcars were built, with many in regular service into the 1960s. But only 3 examples survived into preservation. GWR No. 22 was built in Swindon in 1940 and is one of the 4th and final designs of railcar, and is heavier than the earlier versions because of the addition of standard railway buffers and draw gear. With driving cabs at either end, the only railcar currently in working order, No. 22, has been almost completely repanelled externally. Here, the interior is much as it was when last used by BR in the early 1960s, with 2 open saloons with a total of 48 seats. But the interior has since been fully restored. Powered by 2 9.6-litre 8-cylinder AEC diesel engines through a Wilson epicyclic gearbox, the railcar can reach a top speed of 60 miles per hour. Intended to be an update to the earlier Hall class, the Great Western Railway's 6959 modified Hall class instead delivered a radical overhaul. Intended to be an update to the earlier Hall class, the Great Western Railway's 6959 modified Hall class instead delivered a radical overhaul. Changes to the halls by Frederick Hawksworth, the GWR's last chief engineer, included modifications to the frames, cylinders and saddle, plus a larger 3-row superheater and header regulator fitted into Swindon No. 1 boiler to handle the declining coal quality. Together, the changes to the 5 mixed-traffic modified halls seem to provide a freer running engine. In fact, the 79s developed a reputation for speed, so much so that the later modified halls gained the nickname Greyhounds, and 7903 4-mark Hall found a place in history when in 1951 the loco covered Plymouth to Paddington in less than 4 hours. The engine's first shed allocation in October 1950 was Old Oak Common, but in 1963 7903 was moved to Cardiff East Dock until being withdrawn from service in June 1964. Sold to the Wooden Brothers scrapyard, 4 Mark Hall languished there until June 1981, when the 4 Mark Hall Transport Group purchased the 75-ton locomotive. The 129th loco to be sold into preservation by the Barry Scrapyard, restoration on one of just 2 preserved 79s began at the Swindon and Cricklade Railway. Initially, volunteers worked in the open air. Progress was painfully slow. But 22 years after rescue, 4 Mark Hall was revealed to the public and moved in early 2004 to the nearby Gloucester and Warwickshire Railway. "7029 Clune Castle is the engine that started off the preservation era at Tyseley in 1968. Originally destined for restoration in Devon, Clune Castle remains to this day at Tyseley. Based on Churchward's Star class design, the layout of the frame and the spacing of the wheels was the same, but the cylinder diameter was increased from 15 to 16 inches, although the boiler pressure remained at 225 pounds per square inch. A series of exchange trials in the mid-1920s between one of the LNER Pacifics and a Castle left no doubt regarding the Great Western engine's superiority. Number 7029 was built by BR at Swindon in May 1950 and is one of the last batch of 460 Castles, incorporating all the final Hawksworth modifications from the 1950s. Outwardly, the only indication of enhanced performance is the double chimney, but internally the boiler has a 4-row superheater and altered smoke box drafting arrangements. The Great Western Railway retained its independence until nationalisation in 1948, but with the dismantling of the Big Four came the ruthless restructuring of Britain's railways, with hundreds of branch line closures, signalling rationalisation, and the replacement of steam locomotives with diesel motive power. Today, the Great Western Railway holds a special place in the hearts of many, and thanks to the dedicated people from preservation groups across England and Wales, some of the Great Western Railway's greatest locomotives achievements have been preserved for future generations to enjoy.